The Chargers backfield sure cleared itself up against the Dolphins. The Cardinals backfield got a little murkier though. Man, some wide receiver situations got a whole lot more complicated. That's why we're here to sort out the guys that you'll want to stash on your fantasy roster this week and those that you'll probably want to let someone else waste their money on. An all new Draft Sharks podcast starts right now. Matt Schauf and Jared Smola of DraftSharks.com here to talk through the top Week 7 waiver wire targets in fantasy football. And Jared, even though he's probably not available to a lot of the folks that we're talking to at the moment, we've got to start with Kimani Vidal because we went into last week not knowing how the Chargers were going to divvy up carries. And they started the game by giving it to Vidal. Then they gave it to Hassan Haskins, and then they gave it to Vidal a whole lot more beyond that. He was easily the top producer between the two running backs, clearly took the lead in that backfield, and he's still available in a little bit more than 50% of sleeper leagues. So, I mean, he's got to top the priority list for Week 7, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think you can get pretty aggressive on your, bid for him if you're in a league that uses, FAAB blind bidding, just because we're in Week 7 at this point. We know, running back is a position of need for a lot of teams, and Amari Hampton is likely to, we know he's out at least another 3 games, and it sounds like he could miss more time beyond that. So yeah, with Vidal, I mean, it probably was a hot hand situation to start, and he just got that hot hand. He had a 38-yard carry on his 5th carry of the game, and that was kind of it. He was the clear lead back from that point on, and like you said, Matt, easily outproduced Hassan Haskins, 6.9 yards per carry for Vidal to just 2.3 for Haskins. Vidal also beat Haskins in yards after contact per attempt, missed tackles forced per attempt, PFF rushing grade. Vidal also was the clear passing down back here. He ran 54% of the routes to just 21% for Hassan Haskins. So pretty nice role for Vidal if he keeps this going forward. There's maybe some risk that they give Haskins another shot in Week 7 and he's the hot hand, but that seems unlikely based on what we saw this past week. And again, I think you're going to get at least 3 more games out of Kimani Vidal, maybe more than that. And the schedule is fine. If you look from Week 7 through 11, which the Chargers have a Week 12 bye. So I think there's a chance that we don't see Hampton until after that Week 12 bye. If you look at running back schedules from Weeks 7 through 11, the Chargers have the 12th easiest based on our adjusted fantasy points allowed at the position. So it's a pretty nice schedule for Kimani Vidal.
Yeah, and it's a high ankle sprain for Hampton, so we'd like to believe that when he's eligible, he comes back, but those can be tricky. So we'll see exactly what his outlook looks like as his return date approaches. But as you mentioned, the schedule looks pretty good. It's Indy in Week 7. They're 21st in run defense DVOA. Week 8's got the Vikings, who are 25th, been tougher against the pass than the run. So maybe the Chargers lean on the backfield a little bit there. Then the Titans, Steelers, Jaguars. The Jaguars, among those 5 teams I just named, are the toughest run defense by DVOA, and they're just 13th. So there's no, avoid matchups as it looks right now. So, we'll see exactly how good Vidal is going forward. We should certainly expect him to have the lead over Hassan Haskins for all the things that we just mentioned. And Nyheim Hines played 1 snap in the game. So it looks like we should have our hierarchy. We'll see if that changes, but we'll go with what we just saw. In Arizona, the Cardinals changed from a Michael Carter-led backfield in Week 5 to, we learned, just before the Week 6 game that they plan to give Bam Knight more touches, planned to maybe call him the starter. I don't remember if the report said he was going to be the starter, but said he was going to be used ahead of Michael Carter. That proved to be true. He had more carries, but only by a little bit, right?
Yeah, this was basically a 50-50 split. Zonovan Knight, Bam Knight played a few more snaps than Michael Carter, was 49% to 46%. The carries went 11 for Bam Knight to 9 for Michael Carter. Michael Carter remained the clear lead passing down back here. Ran more routes than Zonovan Knight, 43% to 28%. 5 targets for Michael Carter, 2 for Knight. Bam Knight happened to get the rushing touchdown, which made him the better bet, which I guess he got lucky if you listen to that Adam Schefter report on Sunday morning that he was going to be the lead back because Knight scored more fantasy points because of that touchdown. But this is still a 50-50 split, probably a fluid situation. Carter wasn't good in Week 5, so they went away from him a bit in Week 6. Bam Knight was not very efficient in Week 6, so I could see this flipping back to Michael Carter. Even to me, I still prefer Michael Carter because it looks like he's the clear passing down back. That's 2 weeks in a row now where he's seen pretty nice usage in the passing game. So if you're picking between these guys, I still prefer Michael Carter. If we're talking full PPR, probably even half PPR, maybe you lean towards Knight and non PPR. But overall, for me, this is just a backfield I don't want to be involved in if I don't have to be, because neither guy's been efficient. The offense hasn't been great. We'll see if they get Kyler Murray back, but it's just not going to be a good spot for fantasy production.
And if you have both of them on your team and you're deciding every week, then what are you even doing with your life right now? But I agree. Michael Carter, 5.2 edge in targets last week when he was supposedly the number 2 running back, and Amari DeMarcado hurt an ankle. So that could even further help Michael Carter because DeMarcado's been a receiving back on the few snaps where he does play and is not running to the doorstep and then dropping the ball. Packers match up in week 7, so it's not a great spot for either of them, but that seems like another nod in Michael Carter's favor if we're not expecting either of them to have a whole lot of rushing success. And frankly, I'm not expecting Arizona to win that game, although they were more competitive against the Colts than I would have guessed for that contest. But I expect this to be a better game for Michael Carter, especially with reception scoring. And make sure that you don't overrate the fact that Bam Knight has 2 touchdowns in 2 games.
Yeah, Carter sits higher in our week 7 rankings, but they're both outside the top 30. So they're both like, play only if you absolutely need to.
And by the way, on the other side of that, we've got a week 8 bye. So certainly not a whole lot of immediate help from either of these Arizona backs. Most likely one more game beyond that we know they won't have Trey Benson for. We'll see after that. But then there's this Dallas matchup in week 9 that's attractive. On the other side of that is an unattractive matchup with Seattle in week 10. So again, it's just a backfield that doesn't look likely to make a big impact going forward. Wide receiver, one guy who might offer you some help this week or might not. I guess we'll see depending on his surroundings. Elic Ayomanor, the rookie wide receiver for the Titans, who has had a good start to his first season, especially when you consider how bad the Tennessee pass offense has been. And now he gets at least a slight boost potentially from Calvin Ridley's hamstring strain.
Yeah, Ayomanor got off to a good start. He's kind of faded over the last few weeks. Yeah, he's going to have the opportunity now, right? Like he's going to be the clear top dog in that passing game. It's just he's sitting on a 50% catch rate so far this season at 11.5 yards per catch. Calvin Ridley has been equally inefficient. This offense is just broken. They make the coaching change this week. We'll see what that does. I don't expect it to make a big difference, at least not in the short term. So Ayomanor with Calvin Ridley projected out this week, which I do think he's going to miss at least 1 week, probably multiple weeks. Ayomanor is still just wide receiver 48 in our week 7 ranking. So that's like the level of, player you're getting here. If you're desperate at wide receiver, yeah, again, he's going to have the opportunity. You're probably going to get like 8 targets out of him, but it's probably going to, be 3 catches for 41 yards and no touchdowns.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, overall, I think we have to consider it a very positive start for Ayomanor to his career, given that he's a day 3 draft pick, was the second wide receiver that Tennessee chose in round 4, and his quarterback has been terrible. So, all told, it's been a good start to his career. Probably not all that impactful fantasy-wise for us over the rest of this season. And Jared, should we be talking about Van Jefferson instead? I mean, he led the receiving this past week, right?
No. Let's not. Van Jefferson's not good, and again, it's a bad situation. So I wouldn't be messing with Van Jefferson in any fantasy format.
I agree. Who would you prefer, assuming that he's available? I left Kendrick Bourne off of our list for this show because he's over 50% rostered on Sleeper, but he is just 36% on Yahoo, so he might be available to some folks considering Elic Ayomanor. Who would you prefer between Kendrick Bourne and Elic Ayomanor?
Yeah, Bourne pretty easily for me, because if Ricky Pearsall remains out this week, which we have projected now, Bourne's sitting in like safely inside wide receiver 3 territory. He's like, around wide receiver 30 or whatever. Now if Pearsall comes back, I think Bourne becomes much less trustable, but Ayomanor's not trustable regardless. So at least Bourne gives you a chance to have a fantasy starter if Pearsall remains out. And Juwan Jennings, we learned after that game last week, he's playing through 5 broken ribs and 2 ankle sprains. And he didn't look like himself in that game. So Bourne has a chance to continue to play a big role in that passing game. I think he's a much better ad than Ayomanor.
And yet his coach is still yelling at him. Even after Pearsall returns and with Juwan Jennings around, Kendrick Bourne has a shot to stay relevant the rest of the season. I mean, Juwan Jennings really doesn't have a whole lot of production behind him as a pro. Kendrick Bourne, as we mentioned, has some history with Mac Jones. We'll see how much longer Mac Jones is in the lineup. Yeah. We'll see what Brock Purdy's return means for Kendrick Bourne. But Bourne's been around. He played for the Niners before a stint in New England. So there's a chance that he stays fantasy relevant, at least off and on the rest of the way. So certainly a guy worth stashing where available. Elsewhere, Tampa Bay suffered yet another wide receiver injury. Looks like we're going to miss Emeka Egbuka for at least a little bit. We'll see exactly how long. But when we were doing our waiver article last week, Tez Johnson was in the lineup, and I was like, let's leave Tez Johnson out. He's still going to need more injuries in that wide receiver core to be relevant. Lo and behold, we had another injury. So at the time, we had Ibuka still around. We had Chris Godwin playing. Since then, of course, Godwin didn't play over this past weekend. We don't know how long he's going to be out. Ibuka's out. We don't know about Mike Evans for this week. So, I mean, all of a sudden, it seems like we should consider whether to pick up any of these Bucs wideouts. Are you chasing any of them on waivers this week?
I mean, it's tough because we'll have to see, right? I mean, Agbuka's going to miss. He's going to miss this week. Chris Godwin is very likely going to miss this week. One of the reports on Sunday morning had him as week to week. So I would expect at least one more missed game from Godwin, if not more. Mike Evans is the key here because I think if Mike Evans returns, he's obviously back locked into a full-time role as one of their outside receivers. I think at that point, it'd be tough to know how these two Johnsons, Tez Johnson and Cameron Johnson, are going to split snaps on the other side of the field because Sterling Shepard is locked in as the primary slot receiver. If you right now are like desperate for wide receiver help and need one of these Bucs wide receivers, I would just grab Sterling Shepard because he's locked in. He's going to play, 70 to 80% of the routes as the slot receiver. He's already averaging 4.5 targets per game so far this season, has a chance to see more now that Agbuka is going to be out as well as Godwin. So Shepard's like the floor play. I think if Evans does not play this week, then Tez Johnson becomes interesting. He did play more than Cameron Johnson last week. I would think he'd be the better bet. Now, Tez Johnson also caught just one ball in that game last week. It was an awesome
what a catch.
What a catch. What a throw. What a catch. But again, it was one catch on 3 targets. Cameron Johnson saw 4 targets, caught all of them in that game. So it's not even like a clear Tez Johnson over Cam Johnson for me. So really, I'm not that interested in adding Tez Johnson. I'd have to be super desperate. And again, I think you need Mike Evans to be out to even consider using him.
Sterling Shepard, by the way, is the big guy among this trio. If it's him and the Johnsons on the field at 5'10", 194. I agree. For me, he's the pickup. And I didn't even realize that going into like setting up my notes for this, but I think that these Bucs are going to have 3 receivers on the field more, especially for this week's game against Detroit, and perhaps more going forward. And Sterling Shepard's just, the relatively reliable one among the guys that are currently healthy in that wide receiver core right now. So it's not going to be exciting. And frankly, he might not be an exciting enough player to attract Baker Mayfield's attention during games, but he looks like the best bet for targets and production. And like I said, they're going from last week where they threw a season low 23 pass attempts to this week as underdogs in Detroit. I'm surprised that they're only 4.5 point underdogs. I wouldn't be surprised if that grows a little bit as the week goes on, but I think more likely to be trailing, more likely to need to throw the ball this week. So there's a chance that Sterling Shepard is actually worthwhile for some PPR teams.
Yeah, and a good Lions run D dealing with injuries in the secondary. It's a good spot for the passing game, and Baker Mayfield's playing as well as any quarterback in the NFL right now, despite all these wide receiver injuries.
And by the way, the Bucs probably still going to not have Bucky Irving, so probably will even need to lean a bit more toward the pass than they would want to. What about the Rams wide receivers? We don't know yet if Puka Nacua is going to play or not. He's got an ankle sprain. I know that somebody with your last name in an article on our site says that Nacua, it seems like he has a low ankle sprain. He's been called day to day. And I don't know, for me, Jared, if I see that Puka's day to day with not even a high ankle sprain, I'm like, well, is he going to sit out at all then? Or is he going to get 27 targets this week?
I mean, they wouldn't even sit him out in the second half of that game. They still had him up. He played like 6 snaps in the second half. He's like blocking. He's like in the dog pile, like getting the ankle. I couldn't believe it. Please, Rams, sit Puka Nacua this week. Get him healthy. They're playing in London. They have a bye the following week. Just give the guy 2 weeks to get healthy. I hope they do that. We'll see. If Nakua's out, I do think Jordan Whittington to me becomes the most interesting option. Tutu Atwell is here too still. He missed last week with a hamstring. Sean McVay said they expect to get him back this week. That, to me, though, makes him iffier just coming off a hamstring. Now, Tutu last year, there was a 5-game stretch where both Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp were out. And Tutu Atwell was very productive over that stretch. 7.5 targets per game, 5 catches, 71 receiving yards. So, I could see it with him. But to me, Whittington's just a safer bet because he's not coming off the hamstring. He missed some of that time that Nacua and Kupp were out last year, but there was a 3-game stretch that he played a big role for the Rams. He averaged 7 targets per game, 5.3 catches, 60 yards per game over that span. So to me, if you're hard up for wide receiver help this week, I like Whittington over all these Bucs guys, just because I think, he could be the number 2 target in this passing game. It's a good matchup against Jacksonville. They are 29th in adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. Now, I just like betting on Matt Stafford wide receivers in general.
I'm still going Shepard over Whittington and the Rams options because I think he's a better bet to play. Like I said, we don't know yet about Puka. We don't know yet about Tutu Atwell, and the Europe games. I don't want to just
Yeah.
I don't want to shrug it off and be like, I'm not betting on Europe games because they're all goofy, because they're not. Plenty of them are just football games. But
Yep.
the weird travel does introduce a new aspect for things to be different. And especially when you're playing against a Jacksonville team that has done the England travel a lot more often. I know it's a new coaching staff this year, so, who knows exactly what they carry over planning wise, but it's a franchise that should know how to do the England games better than any other because they have played more of them. So that's enough for me to not then on top of that be like, I want to take a chance on this who knows wide receiver, especially if I have to do the bidding on Tuesday night or Wednesday.
That's fair. Again, it makes it tough because it's going to come down to these other wide receivers. Obviously, if Puka plays, these other Rams are off the table. If Mike Evans is out, I would prefer Sterling Shepard, maybe even Tez Johnson over Whittington. I guess that'd be close. But again, I'm at this point expecting Evans back. So that pushes me a little towards Whittington, who, by the way, he hasn't played a ton over his first year and change now, but he's been very efficient in terms of catch rate, yards per catch, yards per target, yards per out. All that stuff's been very efficient. And again, I think some of that is just this system and playing with Matt Stafford, but he's going to have those advantages if he does step into a bigger role this Sunday.
Puka's going to be riding the plane upside down with his feet up in the air so that he can play next week. And I mean, in all seriousness, like, we want to look at it and say he played on it in the second half of that game. How bad could it be? But there have been plenty of instances where a guy played through an injury in that game on adrenaline, and then afterward they realized that it was worse than they thought it was. So we'll have to watch Puka this week, see what his status is for that game, of course. Now, beyond the wide receivers, plenty of teams likely to need a tight end. So, Jared, we've got a pack of them that all could have, their pros or their cons. I don't think there are obvious targets. So let's try to sort through it a little bit. I'm leaving Harold Fannin Jr. out of the consideration here because he's 50% rostered on Sleeper. So let's assume that he's not available to these tight end needy teams. Among AJ Barner in Seattle, Chigakonkwo for the Titans, Michael Mayer for the Raiders, Cade Otton for the Bucs, and Arande Gadsden II for the Chargers this week. Who do you like the best? Both for like, I need a guy right now, or for I want this guy for the rest of the season.
Just with Fannin real quick, he's available in 73% of Yahoo leagues. So definitely check your leagues. I do think he's the best bet here. And again, we're waiting on David Njoku news, but he hurt his knee last week. Tried to play through it, eventually exited. So like Fannin's the guy for me if Njoku's going to miss time. If not,
side note on that, are people even trying on Yahoo right now? I mean, I just talked about how Kendrick Bourne is only available in less than half of Sleeper leagues. Harold Fannin's available in half of Sleeper leagues, and yet go over to Yahoo and people are like, who's Harold Fannin?
I'm sure there's a lot of I mean, we as a fantasy football community need a better way to track this stuff, because I'm sure most of the people listening, Harold Fannin is not available in your league. But if he is, I think he's the top pickup. If not, and you're looking for a week 7 streamer, I like Cade Otton. We talked about all these Bucs wide receivers. They're all just kind of like, okay, none of them are like amazing. We don't know their roles exactly. And tiny. Cade Otton's big, and he's going to be on the field. And last year, in games that Mike Evans and Chris Godwin missed, he was awesome. And even when one of those guys were off the field, Cade Otton was still usable in fantasy. We saw it last week, 5 catches, 51 yards, led the team with 6 targets. Again, like you said earlier, Matt, that was a low passing volume game for Tampa Bay. It was a 26% target share for Cade Otton in those games. So, if Mike Evans is out, along with Godwin and Ibuka, Otton's going to be a top 10 tight end in our rankings, I think. Even if Evans plays, I think Otton's he's not exciting, but I think he's a pretty, safe floor week 7 spot starter.
Yeah, nobody's going to celebrate winning Cade Otton on waivers, but he is easily the best bet, I think, among these guys to give you targets and catches. I think Michael Mayer is similar. He's got a worse matchup this week, but the Raiders aren't doing much of anything besides limiting Ashton Genty and completing passes to tight ends. So I'll go ahead and take a shot on Mayer if I don't have Cade Otton available, if I don't have Harold Fannin Jr. available. We want to think that Brock Bowers is on the verge of returning, but maybe that knee just remains an issue all year. Maybe he misses further time. Maybe he just doesn't turn back into himself at any point. So Michael Mayer could be an option the rest of the way. I think he's at least a guy worth stashing right now. And in that stash category, if I don't need something right now, but if I'm like, I just want a player at one of these positions that has some upside, you're going to have a lot harder time finding those guys at running back and wide receiver right now. I think Arande Gadsden is interesting because he's athletic. He's a rookie, so he's probably still growing into the league and growing into his role. And he's seen increased usage recently. And frankly, anybody who plays with Justin Herbert is more interesting to me than people who don't play with Justin Herbert.
For sure. I like Gadsden a lot as a stash. And you're probably talking leagues, fantasy leagues of 12 plus teams with deeper benches to stash him as a, second or third tight end. But he's exciting because, last week the Chargers were fully healthy at tight end. They had Gadsden, they had Will Disley, and they had Tyler Conklin active for that game. Gadsden easily led the group with 77% of their routes. That was a season high for him. Finished second on the team in targets with 8 of them, a 21% target share. Caught 7 of those 8 targets for 68 yards. Now he benefited from, I'm sure, Quentin Johnston not playing in that game. And it's still going to be tough for him to earn targets when all 3 of those wide receivers are healthy. But like you said, Matt, he's playing with Justin Herbert. If he's on the field for this amount, he's going to have some other quality fantasy games. He's just an exciting prospect too. I mean, he is basically a tight end in name only. He's a big slot receiver, which we don't mind at all for fantasy if he's going to get that type of route rate. So definitely like Gadsden as a stash. Again, probably need one of those wide receivers to miss to consider using him, but it could definitely happen again throughout the rest of the season.
And hey, his daddy was an NFL receiver, so he probably knows a thing or two about catching the football at the pro level. Yep. Let's wrap this up with streaming defenses, Jared. For week 7, I like the Seahawks available, and I was surprised to see 75% of sleeper leagues entering this week. They, of course, are coming off a good one at Jacksonville where they held the Jaguars to 12 points, just 273 total yards. They are the top scoring fantasy defense to date by ESPN scoring. That's by points per game, double-digit fantasy totals in 4 of their past 5 weeks. And before that, a good outing in the opener against the 49ers where they didn't hit double digits for fantasy total, but they picked off 2 passes. They blocked a kick. 5 of Seattle's 6 opponents have scored 20 points or fewer. 4 of those have scored 17 or fewer. Home date with Houston this week. I know the last time we saw the Texans, they scored a bunch of points against what was left of the Ravens, but that's the key there. It's what was left of the Ravens. I still need to see Houston actually be good before I'm worried about throwing a defense up against them. And it's back in Seattle, so I'll go ahead and bet on the Seahawks in that one. Not sure I'm going to want to use them for a week 9 matchup at Washington after their week 8 bye. So it might be just a 1-week rental, but a pretty good second half schedule overall. So if there's room to have 2 defenses, Seattle might be a good one to stash.
Yeah, I like Seattle this week for sure. I still want to pick on that Texans offense. I don't believe in it at all. The O-line's still horrible. The play calling's been underwhelming. So I think Seattle's a really good play this week. I'll mention the Browns again, who I feel like we've talked about almost every week on this show. The Browns are favorites this week. They're home favorites against Miami. So, that's good news for the defense. Miami's implied for only 19 points. That's 6th lowest on the week. Tua has already thrown 7 interceptions this season. That's the 3rd most in the NFL. So about as good of a spot as you could get for the Browns defense.
Yeah, can't wait for a big Browns defense day and 3 passing touchdowns for Dylan Gabriel on that one.
All to Harold Fannin, hopefully.
Week 8 streaming defense. Who you like there?
I'll mention the Patriots first because they're still available in about half of leagues on Yahoo, and they get Tennessee this week, and then they get Cleveland next week. So New England's an excellent ad if you can get them. Otherwise, this Atlanta defense, we were talking about them behind the scenes last week heading into this Bills matchup because a lot of the metrics had Atlanta as a top 10, maybe even top 5 defense heading into this week, and they limited that Bills offense on Monday night, and they will be home for Miami in week 8. And Atlanta, again, if they're this good of a defense, they could be usable even beyond week 8.
Yeah, I have the Falcons as my pick as well for all the reasons that you just mentioned. We headed into last week, like you said, wondering if Atlanta was as good as its ratings were. If you just look at the matchups that they had, and limited games, they had only played 4 games, had their bye, so we're still in the range where we're learning about teams. But from what we learned on Monday night, they look pretty good. I certainly feel good about betting against them or betting on them against Miami in week 8. And it looks like a tough week in week 8 to pick a streaming defense. So this is why you want to look ahead. Jared, you mentioned the Patriots. I threw them out as an option in my head because on Sleeper, they're 75% rostered. The Colts in the same kind of range, so probably not available to a lot of people. And then there are other positive matchups like the Bengals against the Jets where I would have to bet on a garbage defense scoring for me, which certainly might work out. Maybe the Bengals wind up being a good play in week 8, but it's going to be a little iffy playing a defense like that. So if you're trying to find a week 8 streaming D, a great way to look for week 8 and, any week beyond that is to go to the strength of schedule page on draftsharks.com. Makes it very easy to look for stuff like who has the best matchup and who is my best option for a certain week. You can sort by those matchups, by the strength of that matchup in any week. You can check for any position, including IDPs if you want to stream at those positions, or if you're streaming tight end, quarterback, whatever. Easy way to find the best matchups going forward, and to not only see, the week that you might be checking for, but to see beyond that. Because if you've got a couple that are close and yet one of those options has then 2 good matchups beyond that, grab that one. You might have an answer for 3 weeks instead of just a 1-week rental. You can find more streaming defense options as well as waiver targets and bidding tips on draftsharks.com right now. Just check the show notes below for links to all that content before you make your waiver bids for week 7. And check out our free agent finder to highlight the best options that are actually available to you in your league or all your leagues if you play in a bunch of them. When it comes to working the waiver wire, we want Draft Sharks to be your unfair advantage. Hey!